All right, let's go ahead and get started. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so glad you're here to join us for this Pivot webinar, talking about the new enhancements with Route. We're here with Justin Calvert, our Director of Applications, and I'm so excited to have him talk to you today. He has a lot of information to share about Pivot Route and the new enhancements, as well as how you can use it in your linear projects. Before we get started, I did just want to do a quick IIF moment here at Terracon. IIF stands for Incident and Injury Free, and we are committed to safety. And so I have just a quick one to share today. And I think with Halloween coming up, it's next week. Just a reminder that little trick-or-treaters will be out that night. I know here in Kansas City, where I live, it is getting darker earlier. In fact, I can't believe how much darker it's getting earlier, even into the 6 o'clock hour. And so just watch for the little ones. They'll be all hopped up on sugar and candy and may dart out in front of traffic or not be paying attention. But that is my Halloween IF for you tonight. So now as we go ahead and get started, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Justin. Just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free and go ahead and put them in the chat and we will address them at the end. At the end, we'll also give you the opportunity to raise your hand and ask a question of Justin. So with that, Justin, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. Good IF. As you were talking through that, I realized my son is going to be Batman, and his costume is pretty much pure black, right? So, just jog my memory. It's on us to make sure that we have lights and all of those things. Great IF. I'll probably take some time this evening to go find some reflective bat gear or something appropriate. Thanks for kicking us off. Thank you all for joining us, taking time out of your day to sit down and talk about our application. And I'm going to treat this as if we have some longtime users and people that have maybe never heard of the application before, right? So we'll cover a pretty wide gamut. We'll focus on what's new. We're going to start with just what is Route? Where does it sit in the Pivot ecosystem? Why does it exist? And just kind of give you a lay of the land of where does it sit and why. And then I'll go through some slides of what's new. We've done quite a bit of work on Route, and I'm hoping it is well received. Route has been around for about 5 years. I've been part of Pivot for 6 years. So shortly after I joined Pivot, we started to build out Route and provide it to our users. And it is a battle-tested application. It's been out there. It's been used. It can support very large projects. And, along the way, we also learned a ton through working with our users and collaborating with them. And I'm hoping that those of you that do use the tool start to see some of that as I go through the presentation today. So we'll discuss what's new and show you the app as well and highlight some of those new things inside of the application. Tips and tricks. Really, this is just us looking at some of the functionality that makes Route so powerful, and sometimes it's overlooked or misunderstood, right? So we want to make sure that it is known, and then we'll go through next steps, right? We'll keep it pretty basic, but we'll cover quite a bit of quite a few different topics along the way. So I'm going to start with just Pivot in a nutshell, right? Pivot is a group of GIS folks, data folks, software developers, right? We live and breathe this stuff. We know it well. A lot of us have been in this industry for a long time and have dealt with some of your more common off-the-shelf GIS tools and use that to solve industry problems. And we've been doing that for years and years, right? Along the way, I think a number of us started to see patterns. A number of us started to streamline some of the work that we were doing on a day-to-day basis. And at the end of the day, a bunch of moving pieces came together and Pivot was formed, right? And the foundation that Pivot is built on is data on demand. One of the pieces of our core offering is the data that we provide to our users. That data is not only collected and normalized so that you get consistent, reliable output, but it is updated regularly, right? And we continue to add and update those data as time goes on. And what we found was that is a huge time saving for our users. There are a lot of companies, a lot of people out there that can go and grab their own data. And that's easy to do on a one-by-one basis, right? For this project, for that project. Things get much more complicated when you try to aggregate that data, when you need to make sure that that data is updated, when you need to answer the question of when was this data updated and where did it come from, right? Those sorts of things get very tedious, very time consuming, and just providing the data, aggregating the data, and curating the data got our users quite a ways down the road, right? It provides an immense value to our users. But what we also saw was that when we give users enough data, a number of problems would start to arise, right? Just the act of working with large amounts of spatial data gets very complex. You need a lot of compute to deal with it. And generally, commercial off-the-shelf GIS tools do a good enough job, but it's not graceful, right? It's not quick. It's not iterative. If you need to rerun a process, right, you run into a number of challenges there where it might take too long, longer than your project allows you to take. Or you're just dealing with constant frustrations of, we got it to work once, but now we got to do it again, and something changed, so now we got to go track that down, right? And that is where the Pivvot platform came into play. So we have all this data. Now we have to solve the problem of getting it to our users in a variety of formats, right? It could just be providing raw data, right? The ability to just get the data out of the Pivvot platform and do with it what you need. Maybe it's just make a map. Maybe it's handed off to a different team so they can carry out the next step of the process. Maybe it's to do some geoprocessing and derive results, or to create a report, right? All of those things are accomplished within the Pivvot platform. We take the foundation, that is a large amount of spatial data, and now we're providing ways to access that information, access that data, and more importantly, work with that data, derive that data, and turn data into insights, right? Into knowledge. The way that Pivvot is structured and our applications are structured, Aware is probably where most folks cut their teeth inside of Pivvot, right? It is our general purpose application, and it gives you access to our data and our core functionality. And it makes it very easy to see the data, to inspect the attributes. We also allow you to generate reports on the data, right? And you can configure those reports and spit out a PDF or an Excel report, whatever you need. You can also just clip and ship the data. If you just need data, we have a number of users who just come to Pivvot for data, right? That's fine. You can use Aware, you can go in, you can clip and ship data. Aware is our general purpose core value application, right? From Aware, we have two other applications, Sighting. We're not going to focus on Sighting today, but know that it exists. It's a parcel-focused application. And we have Route. And what's relevant here is that Sighting and Route are very purpose-focused applications, and they inherit everything that Aware provides and add specific functionality tailored and focused on their purpose, right? So for Sighting, it is parcel-focused. It is a parcel-focused application, right? So if you need to find a specific parcel and then report on that parcel, Sighting is your tool. If you need to run a usable area analysis, Sighting is your tool. In that same vein, Route is a linear corridor-focused application. And what Route does is takes that same core functionality that Aware provides, and we put some linear corridor-specific functionality on top. We allow you to upload your own routes, or you can draw your own routes, and that route would represent a corridor. That corridor could be a transmission, an electric transmission line. It could be a pipeline. It could be any number of various projects that reside within a linear corridor, right? We also derive routes or generate routes within the route application. And when we do that, what we do is we take all of the Pivvot data, all of those data sources that we're curating and providing, and we allow you to apply a weight to those, or a preference, or avoidance, saying, hey, it's okay if we go over here, right? But please don't go over here because there's sensitive species. There's a wetland, right? And we take all of the data sets that we have inside the platform. We allow user to weight those and to adjust those weightings and connect dots, A to B to C, any number of dots along the way. And it's going to use those weightings to determine the best path along that corridor to connect those dots, right? It does that on a very large scale. That's one of the core differentiators between Route and Aware, is that Route supports very large scale linear corridor projects. Think very large, long pipeline, electric transmission line, 500 plus miles. Route is engineered to take that on. It is a semi-truck of an application. It will just crank away and produce results for you. We also have some specific functionality built around linear reporting, right? So at the end of the day, in a nutshell, as projects get more complex and you try to balance completing the project with sensitive ecosystems, environmental concerns, the general sentiment around that project. As we develop more and more, the act of routing linear corridors gets more and more complex. Now, when I say focus functionality inside of Route specifically, I'm just going to highlight a couple things here before we get into the rest of the application. But a couple of the pieces of functionality that really differentiate it that you won't find in Aware, you definitely won't find in Sighting, are, you'll see in the background there is the cost estimation report. This is not the MISO cost estimation report, but is based off of it, right? And it's important to understand that Route's role is very early stage planning, so you can understand what's going on along that entire linear corridor, right? The cost estimation report is a tool that allows you to do that. On the right, we have the PI editor tool, and depending on how detailed you want to get inside the Route application as you build out your project, you can go in and look at all of the points of inflection along that route, edit those, delete those, add them, do whatever you need to do to get that route as refined as possible. It's still very, very early stage. Route is an iterative tool. It is not a press the button once and it's going to spit out a perfect route and you're ready to go build it, right? It is a tool that allows you to iterate, to ask questions of the data, and to refine what you're putting into the tool to get more accurate results, but it's still going to lead into the next step of the design process, right? So very early stage tool that's used to iterate on the data. The PI tool is very powerful if that's a need you have. If you're looking at costs and where towers will reside along that linear corridor and what kind of turn that tower needs to support, this tool can be very helpful. You'll see a lot of commonality between the tools. When I'm right clicking there in that screenshot, you can see that we can export this data to Excel or to a CSV, right? So we never handcuff you inside of the tool. We understand that everyone works differently and everybody has different needs. If you need GIS data, we're going to allow you to download that. If you need Excel data, that's where you're comfortable, that's where you want to work, we're going to allow you to export that as well. The same goes for the cost estimation reports and any of the other reports that you're going to see in the platform. So just to review, Aware is our general purpose application. All the functionality, the data, the reports is available in Route, but it is focused on linear corridors. So with all that being said, let's get into what's new, and I'll hop over into the application. We'll take a look at what's there, give you a better sense of what the tool does. But what's new, right? The first thing, if you're a longtime user, first thing you'll notice is that we've given the UI a bit of polish, right? And what we've really done is standardize the UI so it looks like our other applications. If you need to switch projects, you go to the same place to do that you would go inside of Sighting, inside of Aware, right? It is more consistent, it's more intuitive. We really focused on trying to standardize and simplify workflows. And I'll highlight that as we go through the rest of the presentation, right? So it looks very different. At the end of the day, the output, I'd like to highlight, did not change. The algorithm that generates the system routes did not change, right? So if you ran a route project before we released all of these updates, it would look the same as long as you had the same input parameters in the version that visually looks different, right? So we put a coat of paint on it, and we did streamline some of the workflows. In addition to all that work, we've also implemented new pricing tiers, right? And along the way, as we learned with our users, we heard some consistent feedback, right? And one was, we don't want to think about users. We consistently got that feedback. We don't want to think about users. And we don't want to stop you from adding your colleague or adding your coworker that's going to do the work on the project for you, right? So we've added the ability to add unlimited users to an account, and those users can be assigned a route license if you would like to assign that to them. We've also removed the limitation on mileage on route projects. Previously, we used to charge by the number of miles of routing that you would do in a year in your subscription term. We now no longer focus on that. We now focus on the size of the project, and we provide multiple subscription tiers, and each tier provides larger and larger projects and quantities of items, right? So we're now focused more on consumables and less on counting the number of seats and trying to deal with moving, this license is in use by this person, let's move it over here. That's not a concern anymore. As long as you have a license to the platform and to route, you can add as many users as you would like, and then it's up to you who gets those licenses. We've also reduced wait time. And really what I'm saying there is we've removed the need to archive a project. Project archival was an intermediate step that you would have to wait to complete before you went and generated your routes inside of the platform. Again, we had consistent feedback where it takes a long time. It would be nice if we didn't have to wait for this. And at the end of the day, we tried to work around it. We tried to add niceties. And where we got was it was handcuffing our users more than it was empowering them, right? And so removing that allowed us to lean into the iterative nature of the route application more, and also allows you to work through it more seamlessly and not kick off a process and come back 15 minutes, couple hours, depending on the size of your project, it could take varying amounts of time. But removing that piece really opened up a number of possibilities to allow us to make some changes that make the tool more iterative, right? We've also added the ability to choose what data sets are being reported on. This seems trivial. This exists inside the Aware application. It's a no-brainer where we're at now as a company, but you have to understand that we have been continuously adding data as time goes on. And when we started this application, we had quite a bit of data, but not nearly as much as we have now. So the need to go in and allow the user to configure what data sets are included in the report allows you to streamline your processes. Again, you're not going to be waiting for the platform to generate the data and the reports. You can just say, you know what, I only care about these 3 data sets for the step that we're in this process. So let's just focus on those. If we need to come back and rerun those reports, we can do that, right? This functionality functions the same way in Aware as it does in Route, in that whatever you choose, your browser remembers. It's going to set it up the same way next time. And if you need to go in and make a change, no big deal. You can modify that. In addition to reporting data sets, we have changed the way that objectives work. And at the end of the day, there was a lot of confusion around objectives because the platform and the application continued to grow. Previously, it just used to be a number of dots on the map, a number of points on the map, and you would put those in a certain order. And then we allowed you to group those into groups so that if you had a power generation point and you needed 3 or 4 routes going off of that to various potential locations where you would inject that power, we allowed you to group those. And we ended up with a number of points on the map, and it was hard to tell how they were grouped, all of that information. We'll take a look at this real quick here in a second. At the end of the day, under the hood, and when you get down to brass tacks, it's the same thing. It's points on the map. But what we do is, instead of saying give them order and tell us what group they belong to, we have now packaged objectives up as a line, right? A line is a series of points in a specific order, and that line on the map represents the group of those points, right? So at first blush, it seems a little counterintuitive. It seems very different. But again, once you get used to it and once you understand how it's working, it makes a whole lot more sense and it's a lot more intuitive. This is one of those items where we spent a great deal of time kind of trying to communicate how this worked, and that generally implies we're not doing it the most effective way. This objective path approach feels much better. The last item on this slide is a flexible AOI. I would say this is easily the #1 piece of feedback that we've received in the last 5 years. And again, we've tried to work around it. We've tried to accommodate various workflows, and removing the need to archive really allowed us to implement a more flexible AOI. The reality of projects are that they change, right? And you can go in and set up a project, do your best to give yourself some buffer, some room to grow in there, but it's really out of your control, right? If you didn't nail it the first time, then the previous workflow was very linear and you're kind of painted in a corner and you'd have to, just reset up a project. It wasn't a huge deal, but at the same time, it was a big red flag that we had something in here that wasn't working the way our users wanted it to work. So now since we're not focused on mileage and we no longer need to archive the projects, we allow you to modify that AOI as need be, right? So with that being said, I'm going to switch over to the application here real quick, and we'll take a look at some of the new functionality, right? This is my project. This is in southeast of Denver in Colorado here. This is electric transmission line project, and we currently have two segments, right? So I set this project up. We were looking at segment 1, which runs east to west here, and segment 2, which runs north to south. In my current project setup, I have 2 objective paths. That means I'm treating each objective path as a separate section of the project, right? I could easily, if needed, just draw on a single objective path that represented one location, right? It is up to you on how you want to structure your project. It's fairly low overhead to go in there and restructure that project if you need to. But just know that, you can take both approaches. If you're managing pipe segments, you can manage it that way. If you want to look at the layout of the pipeline holistically, you can put that in the platform as well. So in here are the line segments. And as I mentioned, we previously had points. We'll go to segment 1, and I'll just flash that, zoom in. These are very simple. You can see that there are 2 points along the way, right? If I need to edit that, I can do that. I could just drag that up. I'm going to leave it be because we're going to add section 3, right? So this represents a project we're solely focused on section 1 and 2, and section 3 needs to connect to another substation southeast of Fort Morgan up here. What I'm going to do is I want both of these. I want section 3 to start where section 2 ends. So what I'm going to do is come into section 2. I'm going to duplicate it. Come in here and rename it. And then I'm going to start editing section 3. Okay, I'm just getting a warning. It's saying, hey, you're probably going to need to reconfirm your AOI once you're done. And what I'm going to do is just take that endpoint, drag it up here, right? So I'm just kind of roughing it in. And since this is a demo and to save us all time, I have the coordinates of our end location, right? Since we're building on top of the Google Maps API, this space map should look familiar to everyone. We also have all of the functionality that Google provides, right? If I wanted to come in and just type in Fort Morgan, it will give me results directly from Google, and I can zoom to those locations. I can also, as you saw me just do a moment ago, put in the coordinates, right? So the lat-long locations for my endpoint. I'm going to drop that there. I'm going to see if that looks right. It's about right. I like to go back to the map view because it's not as cluttered. And I'm going to come back here and try not to zoom too much, grab my endpoint and get it in the ballpark, and then I'll zoom in and get it refined. We'll drop that in. Go ahead and save. It's telling me that I've added an objective path that exists outside of my current AOI, my current area of interest. And so as I zoom out, what we'll do is just say preview AOI. This is going to regenerate that area of interest for me. We do require that you confirm the area of interest. This is you committing for the time being to using this area of interest. Again, you can go back and change it. There's a lot of stuff happening under the hood. We'll get into co-locations and other things farther into the webinar here. But at the end of the day, go ahead and confirm this. This is us just saying, I'm going to confirm that I'm good with this for the moment. We're going to run some back-end processes. I'll go back to the slides. The last time I ran this on this specific edit to the project, it ran for, I think it was 2 minutes, is less than a minute, right? Highlight here is it is vastly different than archival, which was taking a snapshot of the underlying data, right? So let's go back to our slides here. That highlighted the objective paths. Hopefully that made sense. If you want to dig into that more, feel free to reach out to support. My email will be at the end of this presentation. You can also reach out to me directly, but understand that objective paths are fundamentally the same, and there's no limitation on if the objective paths touch or not, right? If you have a project that is, maybe a backbone, and there are some some lines coming off of that, you can model that inside of the application, no problem. I guess one thing I did gloss over is the, oh, it's going to make me wait. We'll come back to the reportable data sets inside of here. Again, it remembers it, whatever you have set here. And then these icons represent all of the data sets that participate in the routing process, right? What you need to know there is that if there's a data set that has that icon and it's not being reported on, it could confuse whoever's looking at the results, either in the map or in the report. Okay. So we'll come back to the project here in a minute and get into some tips and tricks. And I'm going to go back to that same project as we work through these tips and tricks. This section is really meant to highlight, again, some of that powerful functionality baked inside of the route application that's focused on linear corridors, right? And the way that I tell users, or the way that I guide users to use the application, is to start simple and iterate, right? This is not a one and done application. If you have a linear corridor, if you have a center line that you need reported on and you just want to upload it and generate some reports off of that, Route will do that for you. The tool will do that for you. We'll happily do that. That's well within our wheelhouse. If you're trying to make sense of how to navigate that surface and get through a populated area or a sensitive area, right? That's where you need to go in and start simple and iterate, right? When I say start simple, inside of the application, we provide you a number of play, right? And I'm going to go in, you can see that this finished. I'm going to go into our play. And play stand for prefer, low avoidance, avoid, and exclude, right? So if I go into existing pipelines, we'll just use this. These are all the pivot data sets that we have to use inside this project. Any of the grayed out data sets represent data that does not exist within this specific AOI, right? Not saying that there's potentially not species critical habitat points. I'm just saying our data doesn't represent it, right? So existing pipelines within this project are all set to low avoidance. We're saying we don't need to worry about that too much. If I wanted to change that, I could either crank these all the way up to exclude, and that's going to influence how the system routes from point A to B to C, or in my case, from the beginning of section 3 to the end of section 3, right? If I don't want to look at data through the subtypes, I can just turn those off. And now I'm just looking at any line on the map that represents an existing pipeline, and I can slide this wherever I'd like to go, right? So when I create a project, when you create a project, we give you a play with configurations that are set for you. These are not the be all end all configurations, but it'll give you a line on the map that you can at least start to look at and make sense of, right? And that's why I say start simple is just go in there, get a line on the map using the default configurations. When you get that line on the map, you are not done, you have just started, right? And now it's up to you, your expertise and or your team's expertise to go in there and tailor that play however you would like to meet your project's objectives, right? When I say iterate, we can create iterations of that original route in any number of ways. We don't have to delete it. We're going to add additional routes on top of that. We could delete it just to get it out of the way. Just say we use the default configurations, but we're done with them. It gave us a sense of what's on the ground, right? One of the iterations that you should try to include, in my opinion, in every project is the co-location iteration, right? And this is a very valuable, very powerful piece of functionality inside of the app. Co-locations are route specific. So I'm going to come in here to my co-location one, S1 co-location rather. And routes represent a play, that configuration I just showed you, and an objective path, right? So for segment 3, if I wanted to generate a system route from it, I would create a route and I would assign an objective path and a play to it. What I'm going to show here is the ability to go into an existing route and modify these co-location settings. I have these turned up pretty high. This is my co-location iteration, but they go higher, right? And what I'm doing here is incentivizing the system generated route to find and stay within specific corridors inside my project area of interest. That corridor is defined by the offset, right? If I turn this all the way up, I'm saying I want the largest incentive for that system route to find a corridor, And if I bump this up to 100 feet, I'm going to give it a bigger corridor footprint inside of my project, right? If I turn it all the way up, it will travel pretty far out of its way to fall into a corridor and stay within it. If you're routing fiber, electric transmission, electric lines, right? This will give you a good idea of, well, we want to follow existing corridors and roads, right? And again, this isn't going to be the be all end all answer, but it at least will give you a representation of the algorithm output that focuses on looking at any of the co-locations that you would like to use within the Pivvot platform. We have power lines, transportation, existing pipelines. Okay. So as you iterate, you can also edit existing routes. You can upload your own routes, all within a single project. So make sure that you take time to figure out what iterations are most valuable to your team as you're working through a project, and look under the lens of what is the project objectives and how do I need to approach that, right? You can see that in segment one, I ended up with three separate iterations. Red is just my first go, took a pass at it. 2 is focused on co-locations. You can see it went to the south. And then 3 up here was one that I had edited on my own, just based on some feedback that I'd gotten from the team. Okay. All right, so start simple and iterate. That's the first tip. It's a great way to go about the application. Since we are leaning into more iterative workflow, right? The tool feels much better as you get in and start to click around and create those iterations. And again, if your project changes, no big deal. You can update it, create a new AOI, and away you go. Second tip, learn how to use the suitability surfaces inside of the application, right? There are 2 that we provide. The first one is a suitability surface. And this is really just the representation of the ground after we've applied the weights to the pivot data, right? So this shows you constraints and or opportunities inside of your project, right? It is symbolized in a way that you would think it would be symbolized, and that green is preferred, red is avoid, right? So we can see that there are certain spots inside of the map that are high avoidance, right? Especially as we get over to the west side over here, we're getting a lot of pinch points, right? And we'll get into kind of how to work through that here in a slide or two. In addition to the suitability surface, we also provide a suitability corridor. This is a derivative data product that is generated as a byproduct of the routing process, right? Meaning we're weighting the data, we're putting in the points of start and stop, and then we're generating a system route that connects those dots in a way that makes the most sense based on the user-defined preferences or play, right? Prefer versus avoid. The suitability corridor shows you a representation of what was produced by the algorithm and highlights in blue the determined path for the route that was drawn on the map. And then the green areas represent slightly higher cost, right? Nothing is definitive. There's no number that I can put to this. Think plus or minus 5 to 10%. But really what this is meant to do is illustrate opportunities inside of your project to potentially take a different path, right? And again, we'll get into this in more detail, but you can see some of those start to bubble out in the north here of our preferred location, and a little bit in the bottom, right? There's some more here. And so if there's a reason to use these alternative methods, this is a great tool to drop into the map when you're editing inside of the application. I'm going to build on those 2 cost surfaces for the next 2 tips here. The next tip I have is play adjustment and using that suitability surface in the pivot data. If I go back to our project inside of the platform, I'm going to do a couple things here. First, I'm going to just turn off the project because it's showing us the AOI and it's just adding, some gray to the map. So we'll just get rid of that, no big deal. And then I'm going to come back over here and turn on the segment 1 co-location suitability map. Within the Pivot platform, I can then take a look at the suitability map and drape the pivot data on top, right? As you use the tool more and as you start to get more familiar with the suitability surfaces, you start to understand what is being displayed and what data sets we should go inspect, right? These points generally refer back to a point data set, such as structures and infrastructure. The blocks here probably going to tie back to land ownership. And then down here, I know, just because of my general knowledge of the area and the project, that this is a water body, right? We are taking a large amount of data and putting it on top of each other and just munging it all together, right? So you'll see that land ownership might not always pop, right? But just know kind of what you're looking for. And I'm going to hone in on this section down here, right? So I'm going to drape. I'm going to start with NWI wetlands and just turn that on. You'll see that we instantly get a highlight there. I could also turn on water body. You'll see that I'm using the filter at the top of the layers panel here. I can turn that on as well if I want to look at that information. It's sitting underneath NWI wetlands, so probably not that useful. But now that I have that on, what I can do is zoom in if I want to see kind of what is driving this section. I know it's a wetland, I know it's a water body, but this applies to all of the data that's inside of the route platform here. Being that I'm looking for this NWI wetlands, I know that that is going to be inside of the environmental section of the pivot search. And I got one result because I zoomed right in on it. I got very specific on my click, and I can then open that up and see that it's an NWI wetland with a description of lake, right? If we go back to our play, I'm going to use similar functionality. I'm just going to come in here and type in lake. It's going to filter me down through all those data sets. One of the things inside the play, it's very overwhelming because there's a lot of configurations. But using this methodology of looking at the cost surface, using the pivot data, and then getting back into the play, I can see what is set for this specific subtype within the pivot data and determine if I want to make changes, right? So as I'm working through this project and refining what I'm looking at, I can use that methodology across the board. What we saw to the west here is we're getting into this area here where there's not a lot of room to work, right? This is a good opportunity to come in and use that cost surface and the underlying data to look at what's going on, determine if we can make some changes to the play there, and understanding, for this data set, who owns this specific area that's being highlighted as highly avoidance, right? A high avoid area. So that's the suitability surface. And one of the best ways, once you have that initial route, right? When I said keep it simple, just get a line on the map. What that line is going to do is give you a high level overview of what's going on inside this project. It'll give you the suitability and the corridor surface, and then you can go in and start to look at opportunities and constraints within your project, right? Very powerful way to work through a project if you're trying to gain very deep understanding, especially in these highly constrained areas as we're seeing to the west of our project. Next, I'm going to use the suitability corridor and highlight how to edit routes. This is a surface that allows us to view opportunities. I'm going to clean my map up here a little bit and just get rid of those items. And we're going to go back to this suitability section. Filter. I'm going to switch from my segment 1 colocation suitability to segment 1 suitability corridor. These surfaces are only available for system generated routes. So it's another reason, it's another compelling reason to even if you're uploading routes, just get a line on the map that the system generates, because it's going to provide you some additional context in the form of these cost surfaces, right? We went over colocation. I showed you how I had that set up. And what I see when I turn this on is that colocation is represented quite a bit inside of the suitability corridor surface, right? These straight lines on the map represent the roads. I'm assuming they're roads. They could be a railroad. They could be a pipeline, right? It looks like an off-ramp or an on-ramp right there. So we'll go with roads. And again, we could go in and turn that data on and drape it on top. It is in fact the roads. We could find out what road it is. We could also just use the pivot base map. If I found myself in a situation where I needed to edit a route and use the existing corridors, come back to the east, right? In my example down here for Route 2, segment 1, flash it. There we go, segment 1 colocation. If I was in a position where I needed to create an additional iteration of this route, I could just duplicate it. And I'm going to leave the name for now. We'll clean that up later. And I'm going to edit it. Once I go into editing mode, what this is allowing me to do is look at the PIs. If I want to look at those, if I want to hide them, I can just click on that and it'll get rid of them. But what we can see is there's an additional option to go to the north here if that makes sense, right? And right now we don't know if it makes sense. And so what we can do is just go in and edit the route. And if I click on the vertices, it'll get rid of those for me, right? You can do this in GIS, Google Earth, whatever you feel like makes sense. You can also just do it right inside the Pivot platform, right? So we don't try to make you leave the platform if you don't want to, but you see how you can come in here, edit this route, and use the existing corridors to understand where there are opportunities to take a different path, right? The other good example here is going to the south. This is quite a bit out of the way, and it really depends on if there's a big constraint right here in the middle that's really not coming up based on the way that we have the play configured, right? So the output is going to be heavily dependent on how you configure the play inside of the platform. So with that, we went through quite a bit of information. I'd like to leave some time for questions, comments, anything else that came up over the course of the presentation. But we've done quite a bit of work inside the route application. It is a very powerful application if you do have linear corridor routing needs. If you're a longtime user, we are interested in your feedback, especially if you've been in using the tool since we've released all of these new features and functionality. Let us know what's working, what's not working, what's missing, right? If there's linear corridor specific functionality where we could put it in there and it would make a big difference in your day-to-day activities, please let us know. If you're an existing account holder and you don't have Route or haven't taken a look at Route, let us know. Reach out to myself for support and we can set up a trial. We can provide some training. We can do a quick demonstration and you can talk through what your project needs and how you could potentially use the Route application. And then finally, if you do have needs and you don't have the capacity or the desire to use the Route application yourself, feel free to reach out because we do have a team that knows how to use the tool and with your guidance can help you make sense of your linear corridor project, do the work for you, press the buttons, save some time on your side, add some capacity to your team, and we're ready and prepared to take that on for you. So please reach out if you are interested in any way in engaging with the Route team to use the application or find a use for it inside of any of your projects. With that being said, I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions or comments that came up during the presentation today. And again, thank you for your time and your attention during the presentation. Feel free to reach out to me directly with my email down there if you want a demo or need anything from us.
Thanks so much, Justin, for this information. We really appreciate it. I do see one question in the chat. It says, can you show the facilities as well? I think this is in relation to the visualization on the platform. If yes, do you need to use a linear corridor or a parcel focus tool?
Can you show the facilities? So let me limit my response, and if we want to take this offline, we absolutely can. We can represent facilities on the map. We can add our own data and use that either for routing or just for visual purposes. If you're trying to find a place to locate a facility, that would be better suited for the siting application, right? So it really depends on what you mean by that. And, I might be missing the mark, but we'd be happy to take that offline. I think we have a couple of different approaches and we could consult with you on kind of the best approach to meet your needs there. Good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. At this time, if there's any other questions, you can use the little raise hand feature at the top of your screen, or you can go ahead and put those in the chat. And like Justin said, if you have other questions, if you want to see a demo, if you'd like to talk with the Pivot folks about some of our services work where we can get into Route and run your corridor studies for you, we're happy to do that as well. You can always reach out to him. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you so much for taking some time out of our busy schedules. And thank you so much, Justin, for all this great information. We will be sending out a recording of this presentation as well, so feel free to share with your colleagues. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.